So the main problem I have with my TT600 is that I have no spark at the spark plug. Now, according to this manual, the 600 is equipped with a capacitor discharge ignition system. And basically, according to the way you read this, AC from the alternator is rectified to DC and is used to charge the capacitor. As the piston approaches the firing position, a pulse from the pickup coil is used to trigger the silicone-controlled rectifier. Rectifier in turn allows the capacitor to discharge into the primary circuit of the ignition coil. The voltage is amped up to the secondary circuit to a value sufficient to fire the spark plug. I didn't find one single source that convinced me, or that was convinced, that you could actually test a CDI. Most people I talked to and most of the reading that I found said you have to test all of the other components of the ignition system, and if none of those are failing, none of those are too far out of spec, then you can pretty much guess that it's the CDI. And apparently the CDI is notorious for failing over time. So in summary, on my 1984 Yamaha TT600, my no sparky situation, I needed to test everything that I could in the ignition system before I ruled that the CDI had gone bad like I had been told and I had suspected from the beginning. So the first thing I did was I tested the spark plug. I didn't actually make sure that the spark plug that was in there was any good because I had spares. So I did it the lazy man's way. I had 3 of these. I tried all 3. They're all gapped appropriately, and for this bike the gap on these is 0.028. So they were all gapped, they were all clean. I figured at least one of the 3 should work. None of them did as far as getting any spark, so I figured spark plugs were okay. The next thing I did was test the kill switch. Here's a kill switch that's off the bike, and in order to do that, first off I pulled the kill switch off the handlebars, just looked in here to make sure that there was no corrosion or broken wires or cobwebs. Those spiders have a tendency to get in and really mess with electronics. And then I simply disconnected these 2 wires from the terminal down at the CDI and the other wire harness. So I removed that from the system. Still didn't have any spark, so I went with the assumption that the kill switch was okay. The next thing I did was test my ignition coil, and the readings on this were a little bit high according to the specs. I actually went to the trouble of finding another ignition coil at a salvage yard. Its specs were a little bit high. According to one guy that I talked to who really knows his stuff, these specs are pretty close to what other bikes have, so he wasn't quite confident in the specs within the manual. But I tested the other one. It was a little high, so I took a chance and determined that my ignition coil was going to be okay. So I stopped with that after I tested it, and that one, you know, that one's kind of iffy. And the last thing I did was test the alternator using the pickup coil connections and the source coil, and all of those readings fell well within the specs in the manual. So based on this, everything here seemed to be working good, so I kind of determined that my last source of the problem was actually the CDI. You can't test these. You do all of this stuff here, and if all of that works, this is kind of where you naturally are led to. This is the CDI out of the TT600. You can see this is the wiring bundle that goes down to the alternator. This is the wire that goes to the ignition coil, and these are the wires that are part of the kill switch. So I removed that. I was lucky enough to find a used one of these available, and I picked that up, and we're going to get that plugged in and see if that was my problem. This CDI, brand new, stock OEM, is a pricey piece of equipment. So go through this list before you get to this point. These are $400 to $500 if you want one brand new with the shiny OEM sticker on it. I managed to find one that was used. I was assured that it worked, came off a running bike, so I took a chance and picked it up, and we'll go ahead and plug it in. We'll see if that was ultimately the problem. Well, I got my new used CDI today. This is a CDI off of a 1986 TT600. All the wiring is the same. The only difference is the original has these two little ears, or these tabs on the edge of that CDI so that it can be mounted to the frame. So my guess is on the 86 they've got some kind of a harness. So I'm going to just reproduce that, probably using a couple of pieces of soft aluminum so that I can clamp that CDI in place. I'm going to go around to the other side, and we're going to get this thing hooked up, and we're going to test it with all of the old original ignition coils and spark plugs and alternator that are in the bike, and we'll see if we've got some spark. So as you can see here, I've got my original ignition coil there, got the kill switch, everything wired up there coming off the CDI that I just put in. And over here is the wiring harness coming off the alternator, and here's the wiring harness coming off the new CDI. This is the old CDI right here, and the plug's the same. It's got the brown and the red wire, so everything is going to mate right up the way it's supposed to be. I'm going to make sure those are clicked so you got a good connection, and also to keep the dirt and the water and all the other bad stuff out. Okay, so CDI's hooked back up, got the coil hooked up, got a spark plug in there. Well, now it's the moment of truth. I'm going to move this over here and see if we get some spark. Try and zoom in here, and hopefully we've got spark, and hopefully you'll be able to see it. The way I'm going to do this is I'm going to keep the spark plug and the spark plug boot out of the block and just ground it to the motor right here. This is something I do on just about everything that I'm testing spark. The only thing I don't want to do is touch the metal here, but if I'm touching the boot here and I'm insulated, then I just make sure that I've got a good ground, a good connection there, and we'll see if we can get this thing to kick over. These TT600s have a lot of compression, so they do have a compression release, and sometimes it takes a little bit of lead in your pencil to get things to move. And there we go. Stand by. Let me get that compression to release. There we go. Well, hopefully you could see that spark, because I certainly could. So everything's original except the CDI, which just proves that that was my problem. So we're ready to put this back together. At this point I've gone through the carburetor, I've cleaned out the fuel tank, petcock, gasoline valve assembly, whatever you want to call it. I've gone through and I've cleaned out the air filter. I put a new chain on it because it was frozen up, and this thing's ready to go.